Welcome to Africa's online aviation TV show, The Focus Sessions, broadcasting once every 2 months on this frequency. My name is Tom Kok and I'm the director of the Aviassist Foundation. The Aviassist Foundation has been promoting aviation safety in Africa since 1995. In the Focus Sessions, we talk about things that are crucial if we want to raise the bar on safety in Africa, and we introduce you to inspiring safety professionals. Today's focus session is dedicated to psychological safety in combination with mental well-being, a new topic in our industry around the globe, not just in Africa. Today at our table we are joined by an airline captain who is concerned about the lack of understanding of mental health issues for pilots. Captain Cullen has over 13,000 flying hours, is an accredited accident investigator and a researcher at Trinity College Dublin in Ireland. Paul, welcome to the table.
Thank you.
Great to have you here. Also at the table today is a humanitarian service specialist with a background in occupational therapy. She is currently studying for her doctorate in missing people and the support to families in need in Africa. Otibho Agbareh will share her experience on psychological resilience from the many major disasters she's been attending to. We'll be exploring if there is a link between psychological safety and how we care for our people from a mental well-being perspective. Welcome, Otibho, to today's session.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. But in a moment, I'll start with my third guest here at the table, the author of a new and fascinating book about safety leadership. Dr. Robert Jan de Boer will share his experience from the many domains he has worked in as a researcher, from oil and gas production to healthcare to aviation. Welcome again back to the table, Rob Jan.
Thanks.
Great to have all three of you here. But I'm asking for a little more patience from you at the table here. Before we go to a brief video of Amy Edmondson, there are two more things I have to deal with. First of all, let me give the viewers, you out there, a little more information on how you can enroll in our popular prize draw. For the regular viewers, it's a familiar procedure, but we're always welcoming new viewers for whom this great chance is new. In the prize draw, you have a chance to win $100 in cash in each episode. And we do this for two reasons. The first is that the game, if you like, will give you some insight into what inspires my guests here at the table. And the second one is simple. It gives you a chance to win $100. You'll see a web address at the bottom of the screen. And at that page, you can submit the 3 letters that I'll give you throughout the broadcast, and that together form a 3-letter code. Every 10 minutes or so, we'll show you one of the favorite books of a guest here at the table. And all you have to do is write down the first letter of the first name of the author, and you'll end up with a 3-letter code. You enter those 3 letters on the Google form page and then click Submit. And here's the important thing: you can only submit your 3-letter code until 15 minutes after the end of this focus session. From among the correct answers, we'll draw one lucky winner and send that person her or his $100 in mobile money. We'll announce the winner on our LinkedIn page, so that's an extra good reason to follow us on LinkedIn as well. And the second thing I'd like to do before we start exploring psychological safety and mental well-being is to give you an impression of the work of Aviassist with this beautiful video made for us here at the Tata Studios.
Africa, a continent on the rise. Africa is the world's second biggest air transport growth market, and there is a lot to do. Africa is in the process of giving the continental aviation industry a place on the world map, on all fronts. This requires unprecedented efforts, even more so in a post-COVID-19 recovery. It means eliminating a backlog, but also respecting sustainability and CO2 emissions, building safety on the ground and in the air with technical and operational training. More than ever, international cooperation is vital to give what is arguably the most important economic link between Africa and the rest of the world, connecting people across the vast distances in Africa. An essential link, and that's why there is Aviassist. Africa and Aviassist. We have been leading, building and supporting safety promotion for the African aviation industry since 1995. Affordable, independent and professional. We stand up for aviation safety in Africa. We change attitudes and produce safety. Our professionals support African professionals, and we do it with passion by delivering on-site and online courses across Africa and more. AviAssist. Join us in Kigali or anywhere else on the continent. The African aviation industry needs you right now, more than ever. AviAssist.
So much for the sales pitch for aviassist. Now, before we get started with our discussion about psychological safety and mental well-being with my guests here at the table in the Tata Online studio, let's look at a short video from Amy Edmondson, a professor of leadership at Harvard Business School, who's well known for her pioneering work on psychological safety. Professor Edmondson helps us set the scene, if you like. Let's have a look.
Are you afraid to speak up at work? Or when you do speak up, your ideas are shot down? Or where there's negative consequences for failing? If you said yes to any of these, then you probably work in a psychologically unsafe environment. But there is still hope. Here's advice from the expert on psychological safety, Harvard Business School professor Amy Edmondson.
First of all, it's absolutely natural to think about the people above you and how they're not doing things that would make it psychologically safe for you. I think the most important thing you can do is think instead about your peers and possibly the people below you. There is always something you can do to make your work environment a little bit more psychologically safe for others. So just start where you are and start expressing curiosity and interest in what other people are thinking. Listen carefully, be respectful, be thoughtful. That will make a difference. And those little moments of difference making add up to a more psychologically safe pocket at work.
A very clear description by Amy Edmondson, I think. And it's also nice to see how she tries to get our focus away from what your management should do, but look at how we each can create our own pocket of psychological safety. Now, Robert, that brings me to you. In your book, you also deal with psychological safety. How would you describe it?
Psychological safety is very important for safety in general because it allows us to hear bad news and to react to that. And so, like Amy has described in her book, an environment where you are not treated for what you say and not suffering the negative consequences of being critical is an excellent environment to foster safety in.
So in your book you speak of psychological safety as creating an environment that is conducive to honesty and transparency, allowing bad news to be shared and acted upon. Why is that important for safety promotion?
It's very important because many signals of where things are unsafe are hidden from management's view. They occur in the operational area, and low down in the grassroots. And so if we don't have people acting upon those signals, then the signals don't come up for management to respond to that.
So to learn as an organization really about what happens, what is safe, what is unsafe in the organization.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Paul, I mean, with your background in research next to the airline captaining, how do you see that as a researcher and a pilot in terms of aviation well-being for the workers? How does that psychological safety sit there, you think?
Well, as Robert Jan mentioned there, if the management don't have a clear picture of what's going on, they can't manage the associated risks. And from our own research, we saw that the vast majority of pilots who had experienced the mental health issue, over 90% were not declaring it to their employer. So the employer doesn't have a real measure of the issues at stake. And the resources that they do have in place, like sort of EAP, peer support program, employee assistance programs, very often they're the best resource available that nobody's using.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
So they have EAPs in place?
Yes, a lot of airlines that we looked at had EAPs and peer support programs in place, but they were been tremendously underutilised by the staff. Now, pilots who were seeking support, the vast majority were seeking support outside of the work environment. And like, to put things in context, 1/3 of pilots admitted to seeking help for a mental health issue, yet only 10 to 15% of those pilots sought support within the work environment.
Okay.
So the measurement of the problem it's dramatically undermeasured, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I guess, if you take that to Africa, the experience we have as a foundation is that, particularly I think the Corona period has really made airlines, airport operators, air traffic control become more open about it, because actually in reality, the number of peer support systems in place between the Sahara and South Africa, where we mostly work, is very low. It's a very new issue, but it's very nice to see that, for example, Rwandair, one of the airlines we work with, are embracing it. We've actually delivered the first peer support training there. So, yes, on the one hand, in your research, which was mostly in a Western setting, if you like, it's there, but it seems we have to work on it a bit more in the African setting. And that possibly takes me to you, Otibho, because a whole variety of things you've been involved in, but amongst others also some research you did in Tanzania, I think, around mental well-being, which wasn't aviation related, but
no, it wasn't.
Tell us about it.
So I worked out in Mtwara, which is a small rural place in Tanzania, in a hospital out there. And one thing was quite interesting when you talk about mental health or people openly talking about things that they technically maybe would keep to themselves, is that once you offer up an opportunity to have those conversations in a confidential manner, in a non-judgmental manner, people actually become very open to talking about how they're actually feeling genuinely.
Also in that local African setting, if you
also
like,
in that context, in that setting. And if you translate that into the work I've done in the aviation industry, what I found that if an organisation has a culture, is it building a culture of normalising talking about mental health, and actually mental health becoming just part of health, then actually it does open the door for the people not necessarily hiding or trying to circumvent going somewhere else for support, but actually leaning on the support mechanisms within work. Because what I found, I'm not sure if you found that in your experience, that there's not many psychologists or people who have specific aviation training to deal with people who may have mental health difficulties. It's really quite a niche. So unless you work for an organisation who offers those skills, or you know somebody who's an aviation trained psychologist, it's not something you can just go down the high street or Google and find someone who can support you. It is a bit of a niche. So if it is coming from the employee, I think it's really kind of a game changer, and people actually going to people who can actually provide the right level of support. So
what I've come across is I've spoken to pilots who have sought help from external professionals, but they felt that those professionals didn't really understand the jeopardy that a pilot faces if he puts his hand up. And the
jeopardy as in possibly losing your job, or
this is exactly it, yeah. And the perception, it's more the perception of the jeopardy rather than the actual jeopardy. And when we dug deeper, we asked pilots why would they not disclose an issue. And I personally had a perception beforehand that it was to do with judgment from their peers, it was to do with stigma around mental health, but that's not what the data suggested. It was fear of loss of income long-term, fear of damage to career progression. So it wasn't their peers or judgment of their peers, it was how it was going to affect their livelihood.
This brings up, I think, an interesting point that Amy said in the video, in which she said you've got your own responsibility, or you can take your own initiative. But I wonder whether that is completely true. I think there is a big role to play for management and the leaders of the organisations to put in place systems which circumvent that threat. So
you mean it's too easy to say it should be down to each individual? Yes, that's part of it, but do not forget also the commitment to the organisation.
And maybe she implied, I'm not sure, that if you start locally and showing your own initiative, that will entice management to also play their role. It might work that way, but I certainly wouldn't disregard the extra responsibility that management has. Maybe also in Africa, where we know that organizations can be quite hierarchical at times.
And a good example there is indeed, I spoke about Rwandair before, we have the commitment, even publicly in a press release, from indeed the CEO of Rwandair, Yvonne Makolomanzi, to this program of training peer supporters, so that's a good help as well indeed. I have to go to the first book, because otherwise the viewers out there are going to say, how am I going to win my $100 US? The first book for today is Personal Effects. And what's important for the viewers out there is that it was written by Robert Jensen. So the letter you need is the first letter of the first name, the Romeo in the alphabet. I think this is the book you took,
Yes,
Otibho?
it is.
Briefly, why did you take this book?
So it was written by the ex-head of the organisation I used to work for, Kenya International, and it basically chronicles Robert Jensen's career. He's quite a fascinating individual, because there's not really an incident within the 20th century that he probably didn't respond to. For everything from Oklahoma bombing to 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, Grenfell fire, he has been part of that, and it's not so much the kind of the forward-facing media sort of newsworthy aspects of humanitarian response he was in charge of. He was his organisation led the recovery of human remains and personal effects when people die, and it just really gets to the heart of the fact that although this is probably the topic of death and looking after the individuals who may have passed away is not something people tend to want to talk about.
No.
But his book is very much focused on the living. He said his job is actually focused on helping the families and those directly affected, transition to their new normal, and that's done through empathetic, caring, and compassionate methods of supporting families through that very tricky time. So that's what the book is about.
That's what the book, and actually I've read it myself, and I find it very interesting because it's a nice combination between just being a great read as a novel, but also almost being a training manual. For the viewers out there, if you go to our YouTube channel, you can actually see an interview which we did in the first season of the focus sessions. Otibho, now that I have got you with me, well, we have you all with us anyway, but now that we're talking to you, you've been in many crises across the world where you work with professionals under very difficult circumstances, particularly when you were with Kenyan as well, where people have to tell possibly the worst possible news to family members who might have perished in an accident. And you would think that genuine care by the employers, for the mental health of their employees, plays an important role in equipping those employees to deal with such very difficult tasks. Is that what you saw in practice quite often? No.
Interesting enough, I think a lot of the times organisations genuinely believe it just will not happen to them. Because if you're a commercial airline, the last thing you want to think about is possibly injuring or hurting or causing the death of a passenger or your employee. You go out for people to come on board your aircraft, have a wonderful time transitioning for work or for holidays. This is what you promote. This is why aviation is one of the safest ways to travel. So this idea of looking at the what ifs, things don't go to plan, it's not something people tend to want to look in the face of. So it can be quite daunting. So I think a lot of the time when we are sort of presenting training or discussing with clients, as I've done many a times, is about broaching that topic and actually facing your fears and saying, right, let's not look at this as the big boogie monster in the corner, but actually start to break it down into parts and steps you can take
if that unfortunate situation
does happen, and build resilience. So if it does happen, you know exactly the steps to take and the support that you will need to ensure that you not only give support to families and those directly affected, but that your company is resilient enough to survive an incident, but not only survive an incident, but thrive after once.
And one of the presentations you did for us a couple of years ago was also indeed looking after your own staff in those situations.
Absolutely.
If you can just take us back to psychological safety, because we of course spoke about the role of psychologists, etc. But I think it would be wrong to have the view that psychological safety is just for psychologists, right?
Absolutely. No, it isn't. No, psychological safety allows teams to perform much better than other teams. Amy did the experiment in which she tried to compare the performance of two sorts of teams to see who performed better, and she assumed that the teams that didn't make as many mistakes were actually the better teams. But it turned out that wasn't true. The teams that she compared good performing teams and less well performing teams were equally bad, if you like, in making errors. They both made the same kind of errors. But what differentiated them was that the teams that were better performing were able to talk about these mistakes and learn from them, whereas the other teams hid the mistakes and tried to not be transparent about it. And so that really, for me, brings home what psychological safety is about. It's about being able to make mistakes, about learning, about experimenting, maybe not talk about failures, but being just able to progress.
So almost, if I just backtrack a little bit, almost the opposite, where people might still have more issues or safety things to solve, but because they talk about it, they can work at it. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's the organisation with the least incidents or the least.
No, incident score is a very bad metric for safety. And particularly, like you said, Otibho, I mean, it can hit any airline at the most unexpected moment, or any other type of aviation.
The absence of an accident doesn't mean you're safe.
Absolutely not. No, absolutely
it might just mean you're less prepared if it does happen. Or lucky.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Right. Well, speaking of
accidents,
disasters, and that, we come to the second book for the viewers out there for your chance to win $100. This is the Challenger Launch Decision. Here you go. It's written by Diane Vaughan. Diane Vaughan, I think I have to say. Vaughan. It's a very Irish name, I guess, originally. So what you need there, out there in Africa, is the D, the delta, as the second letter for the three-letter code. Paul, this is your contribution to the table?
Yes,
briefly.
It is. Since I was a young child, I was always interested in space. I think I would have preferred to have been an astronaut than a pilot. I still actually remember running home from school to watch the first ever shuttle launch. But that book, I've read it several times, and each time I read it, I read something new. The book fascinates me. Aviation, it's rocket science. It's so technical. But one of the biggest problems we have now is nothing to do with O-rings or the technicalities of the airplane. It's the people. And people are not machines, so we need a different science. Within aviation, we're experts at rocket science. We're not experts at dealing with people. And the Challenger accident was unique in that when it happened, the investigation focused on a technical failure. But this lady, Diane Vaughan, is a sociologist, knew nothing about aviation or rocket science. However, she identified what she believed to be the cause of the explosion. NASA ignored her. And then 10 years later, or 20 years later, Columbia exploded on re-entry, and she identified the same factors again that NASA hadn't rectified.
Not the technical factors.
They weren't technical, they were people factors. Yeah. And this is what I see in aviation, that one of the biggest problems we have now is not rocket science. It's a different science. And with our current expertise, we're not going to solve it. We need to look outside of aviation to solve this problem of mental health within aviation.
Well, thank you for that excellent plug for our human factors course, which we bring into Africa on a regular basis as well. Now that I have you in the conversation, you're one of the people behind a major study of more than 2,000 aviation workers, safety workers, 3,000 already, to understand the impact, if I'm correct, of COVID-19 on those workers and the system, and to try and identify solutions in collaboration with stakeholders. Does your research provide any data that might suggest that psychological safety on the one hand, and mental well-being as a shared responsibility between the employer, we spoke about it earlier, and the employee, is there any link? You have the feeling?
Yes, there is. I think psychological safety is one piece in the puzzle. It's only one, but it is a crucial piece in the puzzle. We also need to look at what's causing the problems. Psychological safety will allow people to put their hands up to admit that they're having a problem, but we need to look at the causal factors behind the problems. I think we need to go in and look at psychosocial risk, perform risk assessments. We need to look at how the work is designed. We need to look at how the work is assigned. Are we assigning the right type of work to the right type of people? I think we also need to look at supportive leadership. And also, we need to look at psychological safety. And I think if you look at those 5 or 6 elements together, you're possibly coming close to a solution. But psychological safety on its own, no. It's not a silver bullet. It's not a silver bullet. It's one of several silver bullets.
Robert?
Yeah, absolutely. It makes me think of the next book you're going to pick up in a second.
How did you know?
In organising the work, Nancy Levison's done a lot of work regarding how we can engineer organizations, that's her word, to make them safer. And what we find is that apart from the well-being and the interaction that we are able to create amongst ourselves, there's also a crucial role to play for how information is shared and moved and used to make the right decisions and to form the right people who are able to make those decisions. And she's done an analysis of a great number of incidents and accidents, including the Challenger disaster, and looked at it from a very different perspective, a much more control theory type of approach, in which we look at how the process is run and which signals we take from the process to control it, to base our decisions and our improvements on. And if you take that perspective in organisations, and I have in the past done a number of studies in that course, you can see that that loop is not always closed. And so no wonder that the primary process that we're looking at is deviating from a safe state.
Well, while we're at it, then let's get this book out, book number 3 for the viewers out there in Africa. Engineering a Safer World by Nancy Leveson. So the letter you need is the November in the alphabet for the 3-letter code. So I don't have to ask Robert Jan why he took this book.
No.
Thanks very much. It's a very heavy book, actually, I must say.
Yeah, it's a lot.
There must be loads of knowledge in there. That's the only explanation I have.
There's actually a free PDF available on the MIT Press website, and she explained it to me. She said, I put the free PDF, the full book, on the website, and most people want to have it in their hands after they've read it anyway. So they go out and order it. So
that's good for the people in Africa to know, that this book is available for free if you search for it on Google. MIT website.
MIT Press. Yeah.
So look for the title. I'm sure you'll find it on Google. Now, Robert, maybe also let's briefly, and actually the rest of the table as well, of course, let's briefly explore the subject of innovation.
Yeah.
Because it seems intuitive to me, and of course I'm a simple lawyer, so it may be down to my limited view on the world, but it seems almost intuitive to link psychological safety to innovation.
Absolutely.
And we need more innovation to bring African aviation safety, to the global level or higher even. Where do you think psychological safety and innovation sort of support each other?
Oh, absolutely. They're congruent, consistent. They're causally linked, even not just correlated. Because a team that is not able to make mistakes and talk about it and learn about them, learn from them, is not able to be creative. That the creativity is pressed down,
suppressed as well. Okay.
Suppressed, and so they can't be innovative. So no, you're absolutely right. Psychological safety is a paramount requirement for teams to be innovative. And I'd love to get some view from you, Otibho, about how you believe in Africa we can enhance psychological safety in the knowledge that some organizations in the region are quite hierarchical.
Yeah.
And the boss says what to do rather than letting the people think about it and maybe make a mistake or two and then be creative.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because I have had the opportunity to do training within Africa and like African airlines, and I think the key is to get the C-suite into training.
The C-suite being
like
the management.
Senior management,
CEO, CFO, CEO.
Absolutely,
Yep.
But get them into training. But it's not so much you telling them this is how it should be done, because no one really wants to hear that. But it's opening up the discussion. How do you view what is going on in your organisation? What do you think needs improving? And then incorporate things like psychological safety into the training and into the kind of the discussion about what needs to be done. Because I find if we go in on that approach, suddenly people are like, actually, we have got some issues here, we have got some concerns. And then when they hear about the solutions and way in which they can incorporate this not only into their culture, but into their policies, into their SAPs, they're actually really open to that.
Okay.
So I think that's a really an angle to go into it.
I think the challenge might be, of course, that it's on-stage behaviour versus off-stage behaviour. CEOs might say, no, we're very committed, and they might issue a statement saying we are hereby committed to psychological safety. But it's not always the same, of course, as when the cameras are not rolling.
Yeah,
absolutely. And even I'd be interested to know whether on the board level, physically in the building, in the board room, it is actually psychologically safe. Yeah. Sometimes we find out that it isn't. and that we first have to create psychological safety within the board
At that
team
senior
itself.
level.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So in other words, you're saying we have to first, or maybe simultaneously, but also make sure that that psychological safety is not there just for the chap on the ramp, but it's also there in that boardroom.
That they get to challenge each other, that they get to introspect themselves, that they work as a team rather than an individual pursuing some sort of portfolio. Yeah.
And it's very interesting.
Seen that happen.
We've also done a bow tie talk with Frank Club, one of our instructors on human factors, and he spoke about communication and the fact that you have this hierarchical approach, or more of an hierarchical situation very often in Africa, but that it doesn't mean that you don't always have to communicate to a senior while being disrespectful.
No.
Isn't it? You can still, I think Frank's story is also that, if you make sure this is not about a personal relationship, this is about our commitment to safety as a company or industry.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Paul?
Yeah, I agree. If I could just actually go back a couple of minutes. You
Yes.
mentioned innovation
Yes.
and psychological safety. The evidence base that we have would strongly indicate that our industry is doing harm to pilots. Now, when I say pilots because they're the only group that we looked at in this detail, but I suspect it's every group. But the industry, the nature of the job is doing harm to pilots. But it's not doing harm to every pilot. As
How
I
is it
said,
doing harm to pilots?
well, work-related stress
Yes.
is causing distress in pilots, and our evidence suggests that 1 in 3 pilots have had a mental health issue. But that evidence also suggests then that 2 out of 3 are not. And what I find fascinating is trying to understand why is it that one group are susceptible while the other group are resilient, yet they're facing the same sources
Situation.
of work-related stress. And if we had the psychological safety where people felt that they could speak openly, we might learn what it is that's
That makes a
allowing,
difference between-
that's making a difference.
Being
Is it
the
that some
2/3?
people are predisposed? I don't know. I personally don't think it is, that the data doesn't suggest that.
No.
Are we predisposed, or is there things that behaviours, lifestyle factors that some pilots have adopted, that if other pilots were to adopt the same factors, they might be more resilient? But until we have a situation where pilots feel safe enough to speak openly, I don't think we're really going to learn the lessons that we could learn.
And I think if I can take you back in turn actually to this point of, you mentioned work-related stress. What we find as aviacists sometimes in Africa of course being humongous, so I'm generalizing, which is always very dangerous, but there seems to be a fascination almost to tie mental issues to suicide. People seem to always focus, you see these air crash investigations. We've even been, working with them, that program as aviacists. Do you think that is a danger if we always make that connection?
Yeah, I think personally one of the worst things that ever happened in aviation was Germanwings. The second thing in my mind that was almost as bad was the knee-jerk reaction from the regulators who mandated peer support, mandated alcohol and intoxicant testing, and mandated psychological testing. All any of those initiatives will do is detect pilots with existing problems. In my mind, that creates a witch hunt, which drives the issue even further underground. Like EASA have done nothing.
EASA being the European
The
Aviation
Europeans
Safety
have done nothing, and I know of no aviation authority in the world who has done a single thing since Germanwings that will proactively reduce the risk of a pilot or anyone in aviation developing a mental health issue. And
again,
that's what
that
needs
could
to happen.
And that could be work-related stress. It doesn't have to be this extreme.
When you look at how risk is managed in aviation, like if you think of mountains, we have systems on board the aircraft. We have maps that highlight the pilots where the mountains are. We have navigation systems that allow the pilots to know where they are in relation to that mountain. And then, if the pilot still gets lost, we have the ground proximity warning system which screams, terrain, pull up. That reactive system is all we have for mental health. We have peer support, we have employee assistance programs, but we have nothing that flags where the mountains are that potentially could cause problems for pilots. That's what we need. We need to equip aviation workers with maps that identify what the psychosocial hazards are associated with the job that have the tendency and the likelihood to increase their likelihood of developing a problem.
Have you already got sight of what those psychosocial risks are?
What is a psychological, social? What is it? Say it again.
Psychosocial risks.
Psychosocial risk.
It's a risk associated with the job.
Okay.
But the things we identified were the likes of working irregular hours, the likes of working long duties, the not having breaks, not having control over your roster. But interestingly, some of them are just inherent with the job. If you can't live with working long duties, if you can't work with work and deal with it, don't work in aviation. Go work in the shop down the end of the street. However, some of the factors, some of the factors, some of the factors are under the direct control of the airlines, and they need to identify these, and they need to do something about them.
Yeah, and I must say, what I found very fascinating when we ran the first, as far as we know, the first peer support training between the Sahara and South Africa in September last year, hosted by Rwanda Air, it was fascinating to see how most people that were part of the training really enjoyed it. You know, really enjoyed the idea. At least that was my perception. I was actually trained as a peer supporter myself in that course. Really enjoyed the idea of being able to mean something to their colleagues. Of course, they're not trained psychologists after 2 days, but at least they know how to signpost and say, hey, speak to Otibho, because she has more knowledge on, you know, as an OT, help me out, occupational therapist. You know, people like Otibho have much more knowledge. We have Felicia in Rwanda, our trainee, former trainee psychologist. So this signposting, you know, I think could be an important part of preparing organizations for that, but also pointing out that we are not just looking for those suicides. On the contrary, we should, I think, focus on all the other things, like you mentioned, the work-related stress.
Well, back to the suicides. Germanwings wasn't an isolated event. I've counted back to 1982, and I've come across 8 accidents that were deliberately caused by the pilot. However, in that same period, there have been 1,500 other fatal accidents that I've counted.
1,500.
1,500.
Yeah.
So that's approximately 1 in 200 accidents have been deliberately caused. And yet you have this knee-jerk reaction from
jumping onto the suicide.
A tiny, tiny minority. Yet the other approximately 1,500 accidents, we know that about 80% of those, 80%, have a human factor element. And we know that state of mind or mental health is a performance shaping factor. So I would argue that substantially more than 8 accidents have occurred in the last 40 years, that if we had the ability to look back at them, we would find that the pilot's state of mind was a key factor. That could have been a pilot who was going through a messy divorce, a pilot who had a sick child, a pilot who had financial worries, a pilot who had depression, a pilot who had anxiety, a pilot who was human. Like, let's face it, you know, they're all human.
So I think that will bring us to sort of things like coping mechanisms, resilience, which is your domain.
Yeah, and I think you make a really interesting point, Paul, because I think one thing about any sort of legislation and when you talk about linking sort of mental health to suicide is that by the time you get to suicide, it's too late. Or by the time you're testing for alcohol and you realise that person's an alcoholic, it is too late. And often I found when we respond to incidences and we offer opportunities for people to talk about an incident, what then happens is people then talk about a lot more because they haven't ever been given an opportunity to actually confidentially and feel safe enough to have these conversations about other things going on in their life, like the divorce they're going through, or the fact that that a friend has died, or the fact that they're working long hours and they're finding it very challenging. And so it's not really the incident people are kind of worried about. It's almost like the straw that broke the camel's back. So I think
the straw that broke the camel's back.
Yeah, okay. So I feel
not a familiar expression maybe out there.
So I feel like as an industry, if we are really going to start to reduce the risk of the Germanwings or reduce the risk of pilots burnout or make a culture of safety, we actually need to start from the beginning. How do we train staff? How do we train in the universities and the colleges? How do we then support people when they're joining their induction period into a company? How do we foster a culture of psychological safety? How do we foster a true culture of people being open to talk about, I almost had a near miss today, and learning from it, not
listen to their
stories and not scapegoat people when things do go wrong.
Which is a knee-jerk, I think, a human reaction, isn't it?
It is a knee-jerk reaction. So I think until we have policies in place from organisations like EASA and all the other, and other international organisations that actually come out with policies that support that, then I don't think we're ever going to see real change, because we have almost treating the symptom without sort of looking at the root cause. Until we look at that, I don't think we're ever going to really see some difference.
And I think that's why we're very grateful, Paul, to you and the team at Trinity College, because we're currently conducting the first work-related stress in pilots and cabin crew research in Africa. Unfortunately, not as many respondents yet as you have, so there's a call out there. If you work in aviation, if you're a pilot or a cabin crew, please contact us. It's completely anonymous, but it helps us to map these minute mental health issues, perhaps, which, if they don't get heard or dealt with, stack up to create a bigger issue. And we need, going back to the topic of this session, one of the topics, we need psychological safety for people to feel that they can actually, like you said, Robert Jan, speak about those issues without immediately having a feel of a retribution.
Yep. And it makes me think that psychological safety, I was very much before this discussion in the mode that helps organisations be more creative and perform better. But actually you get 2 wins for one, because it also helps maintain mental health and retain your people, therefore. Yeah. So it's a win-win.
And probably also make it a nicer place to work.
Absolutely.
In the end, if people are genuinely interested in finding out, like you said in some other session we had, what is the silliest thing we ask you to do? Just showing interest in people's daily job. Because it doesn't all, I think, like you tried to hint at, Paul, doesn't all have to be the gravest of gravest things. It can start with things that we all face, family issues or bereavement or etc., which might be that first nugget of pain almost for people. Right, well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid our 45 minutes are almost up. Again, always, there's much more room for more, so I guess we just have to devote another session in the next season, perhaps. Thank you very much for joining me here in the studio today from your respective duty stations in Ireland, England and the Netherlands, Robert Jan. Then to you lovely viewers out there from Mali to Namibia, from Djibouti to Eswatini, thank you for tuning in to Safety Promotion. If you enjoyed today's focus session, please be our ambassador and tell your friends and colleagues about the work of Aviassist. If you want to help us continue these focus sessions, consider becoming a friend of Aviassist. It's only $50 and we nowadays accept payment with mobile money in Africa as well. And you can do that at our web shop, www.aviassist.org/shop. And again, you can pay in many ways to make your life easy. And I can assure you your support will go a long way, because almost all the work we do, including the people here at the table, is done by professional volunteers. So we don't work with consultants, we work with people that have a passion for safety. Come and visit us at our first Aviassist Safety Promotion Centre, the ASPC Rwanda at the University of Rwanda. Lots of exciting courses coming up there later in the year. Or, even further afield, come and visit our stand in Abuja, Nigeria, my bow tie here, on the 13th and 14th of September at our partners event, Aviation Africa 2023. It's organized by Times Aerospace, but if you Google Aviation Africa 2023, you'll find it. And when you're a professional in aviation, attendance is for free. You have to make your way over there, but it'll be great to meet you there. And please don't forget, only you can target safety. Join us for the next focus session as we continue our mission with you to improve African aviation safety. Same time, same frequency. For now, we say muraweho to our Rwandan viewers and goodbye to the rest of you. Take care.